welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be sharing a comprehensive readiness model that we've been developing over the last 4 years and based on our research in organizations all over the world. And we're going to be giving you some tips for readiness, but we need to start really at what implementation success truly is. Because this is where readiness truly starts, and I know it'll probably be hard for some of you to believe, but the way you define the change has a tremendous impact on how you create readiness in your organization. So implementation success is defined as a project that occurs on time, on budget, accomplishes the technical objectives of the change, accomplishes the business objectives of the change, and the human objectives of the change. Now, most organizations will spend an awful lot of time focusing on the top three, particularly around technological projects, but a technical objective could be a reorganization or a process redesign. But all 5 of these are irrevocably linked together, and we have to define the human objectives of the change initially to create readiness in our organization. Now, human objectives may sound a little esoteric, but it's actually very practical. The only thing you can measure on a daily basis when it comes to human beings in your organization is behavior. You can measure productivity, perception, attitude, effectiveness over time, but the only thing you can measure on a daily basis is that which is observable, and that is behavior. So that means if we truly want to accelerate readiness in our organization, we have to define our projects in terms of behaviors we seek to see. Now, this isn't some warm and fuzzy issue here. For any reinforcement to have its most significant impact, it must immediately follow the behavior. So if we do not define our projects in terms of behaviors we seek to see, then we have no capacity to apply the reinforcement to the behavior, and we've lost the acceleration of readiness in the organization. So this is going to play a tremendous role as we go through this. So the place to start to define and build readiness in your organization is right at the project definition stage. Realizing, of course, that if you're only defining your project based on these first 3 sets of objectives, time, budget, and technical objectives, you're probably going to get installation. Installation is not synonymous with implementation. Implementation is return on investment on time and on budget. That can only be gained by defining the business objectives and the human objectives of the change. So let's just put this in a very simple construct for us. Over the years at IMA, we studied thousands of factors and their influence on implementation. We've been able to break these factors down into 2 broad categories, what we call implementation climate factors, which we're going to revisit later, and organizational readiness factors. Now, the readiness factors that contribute most significantly in your organization are sponsor capacity, that's the reinforcement, communication, and resource commitment of people in power and authority. Target readiness is what we're going to be focusing on here today. We're going to be talking about how we reward and the targets, communicate, service, and manage the resistance. To what degree does it fit with the culture and what degree not? And what are the skills, the capacity of the agents of change, those people that have to pull it off? All 4 of these are critical. Sponsor capacity is the most impactful. The least impactful is agent capacity. So even if you assign the very best people in your organization to a project as agents, unless they can orchestrate these other 3 elements, sponsorship, readiness, the targets, and the cultural fit, it's still going to fail. So that's really the construct we're working from today. So let's just define this cast of characters for us so that we have a common frame of reference as we go through this. There are 4 critical roles in the change process. The first role is that of the change champions. Those are anybody who believes in the changes and attempting to obtain sponsorship for it. In other words, the commitment of time and resources for it and the power to make it happen in the organization. So there's an element of belief in being the champion of change. Agents of change, which is a commonly used term, have implementation responsibility. That means if not all, at least part of their performance is being evaluated on how well they do this change. Sponsors is the most important role in the change process. They either initiate the change, sign the check and get it moving, or reinforce it at the local level. So they're going to authorize and reinforce the change. Sponsorship has to occur at every level in the organization, every managerial level. And based on our research over the last 30 years, we can tell you that sponsorship is the single most important factor in ensuring fast and successful implementation. If I had to give you a mathematical equivalent based on the algorithm for the AIM methodology, sponsorship is as much as 30 to 50% of the battle. And the last role of it is easiest of all to understand, and that's targets. Targets have to change their behavior, processes, knowledge, perceptions, etc. So with those terms in mind, let's talk about what we're going to really focus on today. The next slide, you can see the AIM roadmap. The AIM roadmap, this is a structured methodology that we use to target scarce resources in the organization. We realize that one of the things from the practical world is you will never have the full complement of resources you believe necessary to implement the change perfectly. So what we constantly have to do is target scarce resources to have maximum impact in the shortest amount of time. And that's truly what this methodology is all about. And as we said earlier, building readiness starts right from the define the change. Now, no amount of implementation expertise can compensate for poorly defined implementation. One other thing I'd like to highlight off this methodology, and that's going right down to the bottom of the page in developing target readiness. Hopefully, two things you'll take away from this very brief session. Number one, that resistance is inevitable, and number two, that it's not necessarily logical, or what's logical to you is not necessarily logical to everyone else. If resistance was logical, nobody'd smoke and we'd all be skinny. Nobody drink caffeine and nobody drink alcohol, and about 80% of my lifestyle would be gone. So the thing to understand as we go through this, a communication plan is not an implementation plan. So most people think they can deal with resistance simply by communicating more and more. And you're going to find out from the session today that if all you do around your readiness plan is communicate, you're actually going to generate more resistance in the organization. So we are always trying to target our resources early in the implementation process. Given that we have scarce resources, those resources have to be targeted to have maximum impact in the shortest amount of time. Next. So I don't know if anybody's old enough like I am to remember the old Fram oil filter commercials on TV. They used to say, you can pay me now or you can pay me later. And when it comes to resistance, since we know it's inevitable, you really have those two choices. And after doing this stuff for 30 years, I've yet to discover the third no payment option. But in the practical application of this, folks, every one of us, every individual, every work group is going to be somewhere on a continuum between full resistance and full readiness. Many people came to me over the course of my career, and we started to look at this a few years ago, and somebody came to me and said, well, Don, what would it take to get an organization 100% ready? Well, I don't know. I don't think 100% readiness is possible because resistance is a function of disruption, and we'll talk about that later. But so we're going to be on a continuum between readiness and resistance. Actually, in the long run, it is much easier and cheaper to achieve return on investment for your projects by investing in readiness than have to spend all your resources trying to manage the resistance. And if you don't spend any resources in managing the resistance, you're going to get it with sub-optimized structures, sub-optimized systems, sub-optimized processes. So if we understand that resistance is inevitable and not necessarily logical, if we want to implement at speed, then we're going to have to allocate resources to managing the resistance or creating readiness in the organization. In fact, the faster we want to go, the more resources we have to devote to creating readiness in the organization as opposed to managing the resistance. Now, because we're trying to target scarce resources to have maximum impact in the shortest amount of time, we're going to have to be able to know what to do. So the most important value any change agent can bring to their organization is not the meticulous plans they put together, but the unplanned interventions, those things they do immediately to help readiness of the targets across the organization or in any specific target group. So as much as this is a planning methodology, as much as it's a delivery methodology, realize that your job as a change agent and as a sponsor is to be able to intervene in the organization to have maximum impact in the shortest amount of time. And some of those interventions are going to be unplanned, and those interventions are going to have the highest value to the organization. One of the things we know from our work over the years is that you can't underestimate the fear of the unknown as a source of resistance. Resistance is always determined from the frame of reference of the targets. That means in order to manage anybody's resistance, you must be in their frame of reference. And I can't emphasize enough that for many people, the fear of the unknown is a very powerful source of resistance. There's an old French expression that roughly translates. I think it says, for many people, the pain of uncertainty is much stronger than the certainty of pain. The devil that you know is better than the devil that you don't. The fear of the unknown is what keeps many people from moving. It is the only way I can explain why people stay in bad jobs or bad marriages, or I used to do some work with abused women who had been battered by their husbands. It's not the desired state that keeps many people from moving. It is the first few steps into the unknown that keeps people from moving. Ergo, if we want to create readiness, we have to make those first few steps as easy as possible. And so one of the things we're going to focus on as we go through here is how to create readiness early in the process, and that's by making the first few steps as easy to take as possible. Whether it's the use of pilot projects or practice sessions or beta sites, those first few steps have to be safe, and they have to be able to be taken in a way that is at low risk to the people trying to change. So we'll talk about that and how we use those practice sessions and pilot projects to make this easier. The next slide that you're going to see is a comprehensive readiness model that we developed from the AIM methodology. And this is going to examine, and we can actually pinpoint now where any individual or any work group is between the continuums of installation and implementation and full resistance to full-on readiness. And so this model is based on 5 different indices of creating readiness in your organization: the information, willingness, ability, confidence, and control. And we're going to just briefly examine each one of these to show you what it does as far as creating readiness in the organization. The first box that we need to look at is the information box. And the information box is very critical to setting up everything else. This is the antecedent or the activator for everything that happens in your organization, but it's not the be-all and end-all that people think it is when it comes to dealing with resistance in the organization. First thing people have to understand is the context. Whether it's a business case for action or how it fits into the strategy, people need to know 3 basic issues about the change. What are we changing? Why are we changing it? And what happens if we don't change it, or what are the consequences of not changing? That's the context. But every part of that context then must be translated down into the target's frame of reference. If you want to build anybody's commitment to anything in your organization, you must address 3 basic questions in it for them. Number 1, what's in it for me, and what does it mean to me, and how does it all fit? And so the explanations of the change cannot remain at the 50,000-foot corporate level. So that information box is going to have the context. It's going to have what you would typically consider your communication plan for the implementation process, and it's going to have feedback loops. No communication should go out around your implementation that doesn't have a feedback loop associated with it, because what you're doing is communicating out and bringing resistance back in the organization. So God forbid you're going to send out an email, but if you do that, have an email Dropbox. If you use town hall meetings, have a way to gather the questions, not just during the town hall meeting, but for days or weeks after it. If you use FAQ sheets or Q&A sheets in your organization, have a way to cycle them over and over and over again. Answer the same question different ways for different frames of reference. So the communication can't compensate for an implementation weakness, so we're communicating out, bringing resistance back, always with the feedback loop. So let's talk about the next indicator for willingness in for readiness in your organization. That's the willingness issue. Number 1, people need to know what success looks like. How will they be measured, and what will success look like? Number 2, what is the motivation? Does it solve a problem or exploit an opportunity for them? And number 3, what is the reinforcement? What are the positive rewards if they achieve the change, and what are the negative consequences if they don't? And this all has to be set up. And this has to be set up prior to doing any of the work in the ability box. So setting up the willingness structure, setting up the reinforcement structure in the organization is critical In fact, it'll have 3 times the impact of what your communication will have in the organization. Now, the next is the ability box, where most organizations expend a huge amount of time without creating the willingness first. I don't know how many billions of dollars are trying to waste it every year trying to train willingness issues. You know, if we just send old Joe to end user training for the 4th time, maybe he'll pick it up this go round. The problem is these constantly masquerade as one another in the organization, but one has to preclude the other. One has to precede the other. So many times people say, I can't do that, and what you really understand is they don't want to, or they say, I don't want to, and what they're really worried about is they're afraid they can't. So they have to have the skills, obviously. That's your basic skills training. They have to have the resources available to them to be able to change, and that includes the time to be able to do it. And the one that's constantly overlooked is practice and feedback. Somebody once told me if you want to, for something to become a habit, you have to do it 21 days in a row. They were probably trying to sell me a day planner or something, but what that indicates to me is you want to place old habits with new habits. You have to be able to repeat the new behavior over and over and over again. And it must be repeated in a specific type of environment. It must be repeated in a low-risk environment. If I repeat the new behavior and on the second time I make a mistake and I'm punished for it, that's never going to become a habit. In fact, the organization will become risk-averse. So we have to create a safe learning environment where you have to repeat the new behaviors constantly under situations of gradually increasing risk. And there's absolutely no sense in doing that if you're not providing people with feedback on their performance. And everybody should have a model, whether it's a super user or someone to look at, that can do it right in their organization so they can see under completely low-risk conditions how somebody else does it right in the organization. Don't overlook the importance of practice and feedback on whatever it is that you're doing. The other thing that's going to have a significant impact on our readiness is the overall confidence in the organization. No change occurs in isolation. It occurs in the context of all the lessons previously learned around around changes in your organization. So everything is done in terms of the context of the history of the organization. So every change actually occurs in a context of 2 things: everything competing for resources at the same time, and all the lessons previously learned. Confidence is also impacted by the relationships in your organization. Do we have faith in the sponsors that are driving this, and trust and credibility? Do they have trust and credibility with us? And do we have trust and credibility with the change agents, with the target group? So the overall trust in the organization is very critical as well. Do people view sponsors as matching what they say with what they do, with what they reinforce? Now, there's less strategic things that can be done short-term over the confidence, but it does have a significant impact on the speed of how we create readiness in the organization. The other thing that will have a significant impact on whether people are ready for the change or not is how much control they experience from their frame of reference. Control, things like input, involvement, and influence lead directly to feelings of control. Higher feelings of control reduce resistance in the organization. So do people feel that they have influence over the people in power in the organization or the people implementing the change? Have they had direct input into this project, or have they been directly involved? Have they been involved in decision, design, implementation? Now, we have a very simple rule, and that is even if you can't get people involved in deciding what to change, get them involved in how to change it. If you wanted to set up the maximum resistance possible and create the least amount of readiness, just tell people what to change, then tell them how to change it. You'll get resistance to both content and method, double your pleasure, double your fun. So involvement is a choice as a strategy in creating readiness. Not every change warrants the use of involvement as a strategy in deciding what to do. But there is just about every project has an opportunity to get people involved in figuring out how to get it done. So one of the things we know that happens many times in organizations, and I don't know if you've ever experienced this, has anybody out there ever seen change agents out there trying to implement stuff they don't believe in themselves? And all that does is generate level upon level of resistance. So realize that before change agents are turned loose, they are targets of the change, and they have to make the psychological transition from being targets to being agents and champions of the change before they're put out in the organization. So it's incumbent upon your project teams to be able to manage their own resistance within the project team and be able to create readiness in the project team to go out and be able to deal with the resistance. Now, one of the most important thing I could probably give you about resistance in this very simple presentation is to depersonalize resistance. Resistance is not about you, it's not about your project, it's not about your competency. It is a process that's going on in the target of the change and must be allowed to happen. All resistance is an attempt to protect or defend the frame of reference. That model for how the world does, and is supposed to operate, all resistance is an attempt to keep that consistent. And the more we start poking at that model, the more resistance we're going to generate. So even if you did all 5 of these things perfectly, information, willingness, ability, confidence, and control, and they were at the perfection level, which is not possible, but even if they were, you're still going to have resistance in the organization. Why? Well, resistance is a function of disruption. So the more disruptive the change, the higher the level of resistance. Now, one of the common mistakes when it comes to creating readiness in the organization is to believe that if we get targets of change to like and understand the change, we won't have any resistance. Understanding that resistance is a function of disruption is fundamental to creating the readiness in your organization. Well, let's just take a look at this for a second. Well, if we're back up, if we're doing a negative change, it's a no-brainer to figure out that if people dislike it, it's going to generate resistance. But the interesting thing that happens with change in organizations is it does not matter whether the change is perceived as positive or negative. That is not what generates resistance. Resistance is a function of disruption. What that means is even if they like the change, if it represents a significant disruption to behavior patterns, reinforcement patterns, value patterns, habit patterns, work characteristics, power and status, if it represents a disruption to any of those things, you're going to have resistance. So fundamental to creating readiness in your organization is to understand that resistance is inevitable. So the question is not whether you will or will not have resistance. The question is how much, how are you going to manage it, and most importantly, how are you going to pay for it. Resistance and readiness in your organization are ferociously resource-consuming activities. It will consume far more resources to implement the thing than it ever will to design it or to buy the equipment for it or those kinds of things. The difficulty is some of these costs are not overt costs, they're covert costs, and it's really difficult to translate those for many executives unless they understand that they're trying to get return on investment for the change. So you're going to have resistance whether you want it to be there or not. You have the choice of creating readiness or dealing with the resistance in the organization. Pay me now or pay me later. So let's just take a look at some of the very simple factors that could generate resistance. Levels of disruption for your change can actually be predicted, and they can be predicted by understanding the frame of reference of the targets. So I want you for this little application to think about any major implementation that's going on in your organization and focus on a specific target group, one group of people that you know is going to be significantly impacted by the change. Go around, there's 9 boxes in a wheel here. Just take a minute and go around these boxes and think from the target's frame of reference. Put yourself in the target's shoes. What does the target perceive to be true about this particular implementation? So number 1, have low perceived need. You would realize that this would cause more resistance if the targets do not see any need for the change for them personally. They may see high need for the organization, but they don't see any need for them personally. It's going to create more resistance. I think 2, 3, and 4 on this wheel are pretty simple, right? Have unclear expectations, unknown or negative impacts. But once again, don't underestimate the fear of the unknown as a powerful source of resistance. Number 5, seem irreversible. The more we tell people they cannot go home again, the more resistance we're going to get. Now, so if we tell people we're going to be doing a pilot project, we'll get one level of resistance. If we tell people this is the way it's going to be from now on, we'll get another whole order of magnitude of resistance. Now, I want you to watch the use of the term pilot project. because from the target's frame of reference, when we say pilot project, the target's frame of reference is, if this does not work, we're going to go back. That's typically not what we mean by pilot project. Many change agents mean by pilot project, if this doesn't work, we're going to go do all kind of other stuff to you. But so it's always from the target's frame of reference. Have low reward and high cost. Once again, this is from the target's frame of reference. This is the WIFM, what's in it for me. If you remember the two questions, what's in it for me and what does it mean to me? Cause a high level of disruption. The more habit patterns, the more control patterns, reinforcement patterns, etc., that are disrupted by the change from the frame of reference to the targets, the higher the level of resistance. Have low involvement. We just talked about that. Involvement leads to those feelings of control. And number 9 is a very powerful source of resistance in organizations. If in some way your project implies to the targets that they've performed poorly in the past, you're going to generate significant resistance. It is much easier for people to accept an external driver than an internal deficiency. So it's much easier for me to accept the fact that our competition has moved past us as opposed to I wasn't fast enough. One's external, one's internal. Now, in no way am I suggesting that you don't tell people they're not performing well if they're not. But if your project has to imply that they performed poorly in the past, realize you're going to get another whole order of magnitude of resistance in your organization. And we do this many times in our organizations. Many managers, executives will walk into their new departments or new areas and say, well, I've been assigned here to fix. After the word fix, it doesn't matter what they fill in the blanks with. It's all going to be met with significant resistance because they invalidated the performance of the whole area. So this is a very simple way to look at this. We have a much more sophisticated way to look at the frame of reference of the targets. And I'd like to offer this to anybody out there, and that's we have created a new readiness assessment based on the new readiness model. And if you'd like a copy of that readiness assessment, I'll have Paula just email it to you, and you can take a look at it and see if it's of any help to you. So if you want a copy of that, you can just email Paula, and she'll email you back with a copy of the new readiness assessment. On this next slide, we have a very simple model that explains how you get resistance to a positive change. There's a whole, this model only has predictive value if people initially like the idea. There's a whole different model based on loss of control if they dislike the idea. But for the sake of demonstrating this particular model, people start out in uninformed certainty. They're confident. They believe it's a good idea. As the disruptions start coming closer and closer to home, pessimism starts to rise in the organization or rise in the individual, and we get into a place called informed doubt. Now, if we don't deal with the resistance, people actually can check out from supporting a change. They can take a change they originally thought of as positive and start to perceive it as negative. And they can check out two ways, overtly or covertly. And if they check out overtly, if you've got overt resistance, you've got a creative problem-solving climate. If you've got covert resistance, you have to create an atmosphere where it's as safe as possible. If anybody does risk it, there's a non-retributive place to take the resistance, and you're going to have to do that over and over and over again. If your organization has a problematic history of implementation, do not believe that people avail themselves of only one opportunity or even multiple early opportunities to surface their resistance. What's going to happen is you're going to have to provide that safe atmosphere over and over and over again. Different vehicles, different ways for them to surface the resistance. Just like you should be using different vehicles to communicate, you should be using different vehicles to surface the resistance. Every communication should have a feedback loop associated with it. You're going to have to create many vehicles to surface the resistance in the organization as soon as it occurs. The important thing about this model to understand for us is the sources of resistance at the front end of the change are not the same sources of resistance in the middle of the change, are not the same sources of resistance toward the end. At the front end of the change, you're going to get a lot of motivational resistance. Why are we doing this? Why do I have to do it? In the middle, you're going to get a lot of adaptive resistance as the disruptions come closer to home. Towards the end, you're going to get a lot of problem-solving resistance. Why can't it do this? Why is this a problem? And so Obviously, therefore, managing resistance is a cyclical and iterative process in your organization, and it's going to consume resources. The faster you want to implement, the more resources you have to devote to creating readiness. The faster you want to implement, the more resources you're going to have to devote to surfacing and managing the resistance. So when we look at adoption, even if we did all of those things in our new readiness model perfectly, we kind of have to subtract the level of disruption from the frame of reference to the targets and what it's going to take to surface and manage the resistance. So the other thing about communication is if you're trying to communicate a change, then your communication should be a symbolic representation of that it is a change. So if the standard ways that you communicate are through email and town hall meetings, then those are the last things you should be utilizing to create a major change, because there's no psychological cue that says that this is different. So on the slide, you can see all different kinds of different ways to communicate. And you're going to have to get creative. And this is not just creation for the sake of being innovative. It is the psychological cues that something is different in your organization. So the communication must symbolize that which you're trying to create. In fact, your whole implementation must symbolize that which you're trying to create. So many organizations right now are trying to do transformational projects. So if you're trying to do transformational projects, then your communication should be transformational. It should symbolize that something is radically different in the organization. So therefore, your reinforcement should be transformational. Your sponsorship has to be transformational. What sponsors have done in the past is not significant enough, is not of a order of magnitude enough to be able to create something different. So your communication has to symbolize that which you're trying to create in the organization. So there's really only one option from our perspective here, and it goes back to what we said earlier, and that's we really either have to invest in readiness now or prepare to pay more for resistance. Now, as much readiness as you're going to invest in, you're not going to eliminate all the resistance in your organization. There'll be unanticipated consequences that you can't predict simply because you don't understand all the frames of reference and the way they're being impacted by the change. But you can pay me now or pay me later for this stuff, and after we go through this, I think you can probably understand that the place to invest is in readiness, and as opposed to trying to manage the adaptation after the resistance has been generated. So you can invest in readiness and increasing the speed of adaptation, or you will have to pay for resistance in your organization because you didn't create that readiness. And if you don't manage that resistance, then your change is going to suboptimize.